This episode of the Driving Safety Show is sponsored by Drivers Alert, celebrating 30 years of helping companies keep their drivers safe. To learn more, visit driversalert.com. Distracted driving, drunk driving, drowsy driving. You want safer roads, and so do we. You're listening to the Driving Safety Show. Hear insights, in-depth analysis, and expert advice from key players in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors who are leading the way in making our roads safer. Are you ready to join us? And now, your host of the Driving Safety Show, Rich Sordahl.
Welcome to another episode of the Driving Safety Show. Our guest today has lived the type of adventurous life most of us could only dream about. In 1969, as a member of the U.S. Air Force, he served 4 years of duty as security police and a law enforcement specialist. In the mid-1970s, he served as a traffic officer in East Los Angeles for the California Highway Patrol. In the first half of the 1980s, he pursued and earned a Bachelor of Arts from UC Berkeley and a law degree from the University of Denver. In the mid to late 1980s, he served as tribal chairman for the Fort McDermitt Paiute Shoshone tribe and the chairman of board of directors for the Intertribal Council of Nevada. In 1992, he launched a career in the judicial system, serving as a magistrate, chief trial court and drug court judge, associate justice, and chief justice. In 2013, he moved into the field of emergency medical services in the state of Nevada, serving as an EMT and EMS manager. Today, he is the EMS rescue chief for the Fort McDermitt Paiute Shoshone tribe, overseeing the tribe's Oregon and Nevada lands. Ron Eagleye Johnny, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
But I guess the one thing that really drew my attention to your story and just kind of your life history is just how, we do a road safety show here, and in each stage of your career, you've kind of had a chance to have maybe a little bit different perspective on driving and the culture of road safety. So I thought that was fascinating, going from law enforcement to the judicial system and now in emergency medical services.
Well, I had an old retired California highway patrolman tell me when I was a rookie in East LA, if you sit home and do nothing after you retire, you'll be dead in 2 years. And so after I had retired as a judge in 2012, North Lyon County Fire Protection District in Fernley, Nevada, and the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe, where I have a home, gave a notice that they were going to do a joint EMT class because both needed EMTs. And so I remembered what Red had told me back in those early days when I was a rookie. And so I thought, yeah, I certainly don't want to die like some of my ex-partners do, because I get email notification on who's passed. And quite a few of my ex-partners have passed. So it was motivation to become an EMT, and having graduated from a college and a law school, studying and taking exams was fairly easy. And it's not much different from being a cop or a highway patrolman working on an ambulance or, helping injured, sick, or dying people.
So in 1969, you went into the Air Force, and much of the time that you spent there, it seems like you were in kind of a law enforcement or security specialist capacity. And I'm just kind of curious, what influenced your decision to get started in your career in law enforcement?
Well, during Vietnam, before the draft, because if I had waited too much longer, my birth date was number 3 on the draft. So I would have been selected pretty quickly. So my uncle was a career Navy man. He, like me, he's deceased now. He was in the tail end of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And then he was a member up here too, a tribal member. And so he would tell me as a kid, you need to think about doing something. The military is a good way to go. and there's lots of different jobs you can do. And in high school, I studied drafting for 4 years. And towards the end of high school, my drafting instructor got me a job with a cable TV company using Mylar maps to plot out the strength of the cable box as it goes down the line to boost the signal. And I used to get tired of sitting in the office, and I'd make up a story that, hey, I need to go out and look at this line. And so I'd be able to drive one of the trucks around and take time away from the office and then come back in and finish the work. So I had just seen a documentary on the USS Indianapolis, which delivered the nuclear bomb to Guam that was dropped on Hiroshima. And they got to go anywhere they wanted. And they ended up off the coast of what later became Vietnam, and a submarine sunk them, and tiger sharks got quite a few of them. And so when my uncle was saying, oh, join the Navy, when I'm not a recruiter, I'm a catapultman on a carrier, we're 13 miles out. And I was thinking, 13 miles of swimming with tiger sharks? No way. And so he said, well, a good friend of mine's an Air Force recruiter, and his desk is around the corner from mine. So I went over there, and the Air Force recruiter said, well, what are you interested in doing? And I said, well, I'd like a job that's outside. And so he said, well, would you like a job where you can mess around and not get in any trouble? And I said, sounds good. And he said, well, then be a cop like I am when I'm not a recruiter. And so I started thinking San Francisco PD, Oakland PD, because I was born and raised in the Bay Area because of the Indian relocation program that tricked my grandparents to go to the Bay Area in the 1930s. And so, I'd watch TV shows when I was a young kid, and, being a cop seemed to be a pretty good thing. I lived in South San Francisco, which only had a couple cops, but we would go into the city quite often. And so you'd see 1950s and 1960s era San Francisco and Oakland cops, and it seemed like a pretty good thing for a young guy that's a half-breed. And so I told him, yeah, sounds good to me. And so out of my security police school class, there were only 2 of us that wanted to be cops. And the Air Force needed lots of cops because there were 2 different work codes. One AFSC was for security, meaning you're either going to hump airplanes or missiles, or you're law enforcement. And so when 4 of us left security police school to go to Travis Air Force Base, because during Vietnam, basic training was 6 weeks and security police school was 6 weeks. The 4 of us get to Travis on the same day because that's what our orders said, told us what time to be there. And so the chief master sergeant, he puts our orders face down on his desk. He shuffles them around like a shell game and says, you 2 are in security and these 2 are in law enforcement. And then he flipped the orders over. And so Carter Honkinen, who had a criminal justice degree out of a university in Florida, he got security. Steve White, who had a degree in music, he got security. And myself and another person got law enforcement. And so I was pretty naive back in those days. And as we were walking out and heading over to the law enforcement building, and Steve and Carter were not too happy they were going to security. I mentioned to him, man, we really lucked out. He said, wise up, guy. The chief master sergeant could see the rest of our names on everybody's second page of their orders on the back side. So he knew who he was sending there. Apparently, he didn't like college graduates. And so college graduates went to security, or maybe they did a better job in security. But Carter was trained for law enforcement, but he ended up in security. And so it was pretty interesting to me, having grown up in a really small town, South San Francisco, back in those days. My birth certificate was number 100 at South San Francisco Hospital. And so it was a small town, and we didn't have much crime. And so seeing the kind of crime, you got trained killers, even if they've only been through basic training, you get trained to shoot and do other things. And so the investigation of crimes was pretty interesting to me. But Travis was one of two bases that had a race riot during Vietnam. And the Air Force wouldn't let us, its own cops, go in to quell the riot. They called in the California Highway Patrol. And so the California Highway Patrol came in, and they pretty much just started surrendering to the California Highway Patrol. The uniforms looked good. And so I thought, well, if I don't make it into San Francisco or Oakland, I'll go with the CHP. And so towards the end of my enlistment, because of the race riot, the military, or the Air Force, extended my enlistment past my date of ending it and getting into either the Oakland or San Francisco police academies. And so the only thing I had left was 20 days after I got out was a CHP academy. And so I became a CHP officer. And then they sent me to East LA, which had the highest death rate of any office. So it was kind of fun.
So it's interesting. So you, in the mid 70s, you become a CHP officer, and like you said, and you're in the East LA area. And I was looking at the traffic fatalities, and that time period, we were pretty consistently for most of those years over 50,000 deaths each year, and now we're down to around 40,000 plus. And I'm interested in your perspective back in that period of time. What was the culture like in terms of road safety and how people were approaching driving as a responsibility, and understanding that you're driving a motor vehicle, it's a killing machine if you're not taking it seriously. What was the culture like back then?
Well, you got to kind of think back to even today. There was a comedian that was driving a 1969 Camaro or something that crashed a couple weeks ago. He had lap belts in that model. Most cars didn't have seat belts back in those days. And the steering wheels weren't the soft padded steering wheels we had today. They were, it seemed like they were like porcelain covered steel rings. And so dashboards weren't made of plastic. They were made out of metal. And so the vast majority of fatalities that I covered were either steering wheels that got embedded into somebody's forehead because, no seat belt, no shoulder restraint allows the head to move forward. And the hardest object you're going to hit is that steering wheel. The steering wheel shafts didn't collapse like they do now. And so it was pretty routine to find chest impaled by a steering wheel column, or that somebody's face would hit the metal dashboard around where the radio was. And there was no mercy in that contact at 50 or 60 miles an hour against a tree or a embankment or a rear ending of a car. So the culture was young people with flashy cars. I mean, we had some great cars back then. California Highway Patrol, the fastest cars I drove were 1968 to 1973 Dodge Polaris. Had 3-speed transmissions. You got scratch in every gear. You could bury the speedometer past 220 chasing somebody and bring it around and touch 0. Now, it wasn't accurate, but you did get the sensation that you were floating when you were going that fast. And if you were crazy enough, as I did a couple times, to look in the rearview mirror, you'd see a little puff of blue smoke when your tire hit the ground, like an airplane landing. And the motorcycles were the fastest ever. We had Motor Guzzi's back in those days. They were only 850s, but they were the fastest things out there. And so it was pretty fun being 23 when I first went on, and having the fastest cars and the fastest motorcycles. The Highway Patrol in Los Angeles County always had the image of a gorilla dragging its knuckles on the ground looking for fresh meat. But of course, we said the same thing about LAPD and the Sheriff's Department. So, but we all worked together, and anybody that put out a officer needs help call, which back in those days, I don't know if it's the same, but it was $11.99. Everybody busted their butt to get there.
So after your time with the CHP, then you earned a degree at Berkeley, and then you went to law school in Denver, and after that you practiced law for a brief time, and then you started your involvement with the Fort McDermitt Paiute Shoshone tribe and their council. I think you were a tribal chairman as well as chairman of the board of directors for the Intertribal Council of Nevada. And I guess we have to cover this now. So you're a member of the Fort McDermitt Paiute Shoshone tribe, correct?
Yeah.
And maybe to help,
Constitution says who is a tribal member.
And maybe just to help our audience, what the location in the country, the part of Nevada that this is, where are those lands kind of situated?
Okay, so Fort McDermitt is on the Oregon-Nevada border, north of basically the center of the state. If you used Winnemucca, which is along Interstate 80, the main highway that transects the tribe's lands up here is Highway 95. And you can go from Winnemucca, when you go north of McDermitt, to either Boise or Bend, Oregon, or any town in between that.
So there could be, it's remote. So there could be large stretches between towns or communities.
This is Frontier Emergency Medical Services. If a person is critically ill, we call for an ambulance right away, assuming they can fly. Heavy winds, the wrong kind of conditions, snowing usually means it's ground transportation. And so you really have to know what you're been trained to do and to be able to stay calm enough to keep somebody alive that drove carelessly, or they drove drowsy, or drove under the influence, or something, or struck a deer, antelope, Mustang horse, or something else.
I'm also curious too. So in the tribal council, what are some of the typical issues that you're addressing and problems you're trying to solve? Is it, I guess maybe what would be the equivalent of a non-tribal form of government? Is this kind of like at the state level?
Yeah, it's a lot like a combination of a state legislature. Of course, we don't have like a Senate and a House or an Assembly and a Senate. We just have the 8-member tribal council. 4 members are elected every 2 years. And then after the election results are called, the 8 members go into a room and they decide who is going to be the chairman, the vice chairman, the secretary, and the treasurer from among them. And you can make your case as to why you shouldn't be it or why you want to be it. And just like in the military or anywhere else, you can be drafted to be the chairman, and that was me.
So then in 1992, you begin your career in the judicial system as a magistrate for the trial and appellate divisions under the U.S. Department of Interior. And then you held several different positions in the courtroom, culminating in the Chief Justice, Court of Appeals for the Colorado River Indian Tribes, which was Arizona and California. As a judge, how often did you find yourself overseeing cases involving something related to traffic or transportation?
About half the time.
And what
could be speeding cases. I remember one when I was the judge for the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe, which is close to Reno, about an hour away from Reno. The previous judge, I guess, had been issuing the maximum fines to everybody. I don't know what that person's background was, but having been to law school and practiced law for a couple years and being a judge who never got reversed on appeal, by the way, I looked at the law and I saw that the tribal council had a range of fines from $10 to $150. Remember, this is back in the early 90s. Now fines have gone up because costs of courts have gone up. But when the police prosecuted their own case, because sometimes tribes don't have a prosecutor, and so the police officer acts as their own prosecutor, and they had an elderly man that had been speeding on the reservation, and so I asked the officer, since he didn't present the information, did he know if the person had ever been stopped before and cited, and he didn't. And I asked him, did you check his state driving record? And he said, yeah, on the computer over the radio, and it was clean. And so I said, okay, well, first offense is the minimum range is $10. I'm going to impose the fine of $10. And so after court, the chief of police and a couple other officers came to talk to me, and they were really angry. They thought the person should have gotten the maximum. And so I asked them, well, why did the tribal council then create a range? If a first offender should get the maximum, who gets the lower end of that? And so they hadn't never thought about that. And so I always ask the officer, is there a reason to impose a fine more than what I thought was the minimum amount, so that they could give an opportunity like I had when I was a highway patrolman. I remember I wrote a person for doing 150 miles an hour on the Pomona Freeway on a Sunday morning, and there was no other traffic. And the municipal court judge in El Monte, he really started chewing me out for not writing the person recklessly, for reckless driving. And so he asked me, well, why didn't you? And I said, well, reckless driving requires that you endanger the lives of others. And there was only the two of us. My car was in good shape. He had a 1964 Chevrolet Corvette Stingray, and it was in good shape. And so I chased him for 4 or 5 miles, and then he pulled over, and he didn't affect any traffic. We had a 5-lane wide Pomona Freeway in our area, and so it, he wasn't like going through a windy 2-lane highway through a populated area. And so the judge never apologized, but he went back to just fining him for speeding. And back in those days, the fine for speeding was $65.50. People from back east used to think that we had given them the biggest break in their life because they weren't paying $500 or $700. But the basic speed limit law in California at the time, the fine was $65.50.
In the time that you were serving as judge and with respect to any traffic related cases, was there something that kind of stood out to you over time as you see the common themes of these cases coming forward, where you're sitting there thinking to yourself, just the senseless nature of this, or just if we could only just take this more seriously, we wouldn't be here? Anything that ever really stood out to you where you just started seeing these common themes always resurrecting themselves?
Well, yeah. Driving under the influence of drugs. So I was pretty law and order oriented when I first became a judge. And then I'd been a judge for a couple years, and I started reading about what this former Florida highway patrolman who became a judge named Stanley Goldstein in Dade County. And he had started the first drug court, as it was to be called. And Stanley Goldstein and his court staff had figured out how to process the thousands of cocaine-related charges in the 80s, because back in those days, Dade County mainly was being flooded by massive amounts of cocaine coming from Colombia and other places. And their dockets were just becoming overcrowded. And so, you know, the old system in the old days was to find somebody guilty and send them off to probation. You're going to do 2 years of probation and see your probation officer as often as they tell you. Well, probation officers got overwhelmed. And so Stanley figured out that, you know, I've got to take some of this overflow. And so he started telling the defendants, I'm going to make you go to AA meetings. I'm going to make you go to counseling. I'm going to make you do this. And you're going to come into court every week and show me that you've done it. And if you don't do it, you're going to face a range of sanctions. You might have to write a letter to your mother, or you might have to write a letter to your grandmother, or you might have to write a letter to your children, or make a journal entry, or do things. He wasn't using court or jail or probation because those systems were already flooded. And so Stanley Goldstein became the major player in what we first loosely called in, I think it was around 85, called the National Association of Drug Court Judges. A bunch of us met, you know, remember, I'm a tribal court judge. A bunch of us met in Washington, D.C. or Virginia, I can't remember where, and we started to define what makes a good drug court judge, because everybody needed to be like Stanley. Instead of thinking, you know, like my days on the highway patrol was, but you violate the law, you get arrested and you get booked. Well, that was creating backlog everywhere. I mean, LA County had to keep building bigger jails because everybody was just being booked, and then they'd end up in court somewhere. And it was just becoming a massive system. And so Stanley had figured this out. And so he became a leading inspiration for what then became the National Association of Drug Court Professionals. And we have all kinds of different drug courts out there. We have family treatment courts for judges that are concerned that their terminating too many parental rights because of drug usage related to vehicles and other cases, because sometimes like meth addiction just makes it to where meth is more important than the children. And so typically the states were looking at just terminating parental rights and looking for somebody to adopt those kids. But they started creating family treatment courts to where they would educate the parents on what it takes for children to thrive in a family setting, and how bad meth addiction or any kind of addiction is to that thriving. And so the parents would understand better why they might have to lose their rights to their children. But it gave judges an opportunity to do everything they could to reverse the trend of just terminating rights and waiting for children to be adopted. Because just think of the load of children being put into foster care placement and all that. And judges are caring people just like the rest of the court staff are. And they were just looking for features. And so family treatment courts became very successful. Then after I retired, I got hired by Marin County, California, the Superior Court and the county. That was the county that the first President Bush called the Marin Hot Tubbers, because it is a pretty rich community. And so I designed their adult drug court, and we could see that drug court wasn't the only issue. And so there was a police officer with San Rafael Police Department, Joel Fay, who became, while he was a policeman, a psychologist. And so he was working with the homeless because homeless were creating a problem, and Joel figured out how this kind of drug court thing could work with homeless. And so he helped create what became known as the Star Court. We didn't want to call it mental health court or anything, so we called it the Star Court. And people struggling with mental health issues, maybe a little addiction issue, but mainly mental health, they got the help that they needed through the court system, which, you get people assessed on what their true problems are, and you help them start working through those. Now, sometimes the problems are too overwhelming, but at least you're trying to figure out how you can fix all that. And so then DUI courts started, because, you have people that have been arrested for 3, 4, 5 DUIs. I mean, I don't know if you remember the old Highway Patrol series with Broderick Crawford, but Broderick Crawford could not drive a car. He had lost his driver's license after 10 DUIs, lost it for life. So he had to have a special permit to be filmed behind the wheel of a car in that TV series. And so you just can't have that many. I mean, vehicles doing 60, 70 or higher rates of speed are just massive killing machines. And so every community has that issue, but through the leadership of some really great judges, we ended up with DUI courts, and then veterans treatment courts started. A couple really good leading judges started seeing veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, and remembered back about the veterans that were still coming through who had been in Vietnam. And so they started working with psychologists and others trying to figure out, hey, how can we help them recognize PTSD and other problems they have, and how can we get them help? And so today, through the leadership of those judges who started the Veterans Treatment Courts, the VA system is now working with them. And so in the Veterans Treatment Courts, you, just like drug courts, you give a chance to a person to avoid a prison sentence if they do the treatment. And so there's a pretty good success rate if you ever go to the NADCP website. It's at www.nadcp.org. You'll see evidence-based research on this is how the treatment needs to be done, the important role that courts can play in treatment. I had a really great juvenile drug court judge, Lynn Dui at Marin County. She started making court sessions part of the treatment process. So whenever a juvenile would violate the handbook for the juveniles on the juvenile drug court, they would be assigned to write letters to siblings. And so her first book, a compilation of the first letters, was called Dear America, because one of the juveniles in the court, their sibling first name was America. She was Hispanic. And so Lynn Duri thought that would be a really good thing. And so I think she sold the copies of the book Dear America, which is a compilation of the letters that they wrote as sanctions for violating the court rules, which explained to their kids, to their sisters and brothers, hey, don't do the same things I did. I did this. You might be copying me, but you're going to end up where I am. And so Lynn, I think they sold for about $5 each, and the community really enjoyed reading the letters because they were heartfelt. From the heart, there was no BS in any of the letters. And then Lynn went on to write a book about a judge dealing with the troubles of being a drug court judge. And it turned into a pretty good seller.
Wow. So, Eagleye, in 2013, you made a shift then into emergency medical services, starting as an EMT responding to 9/11 calls. And today you are in that capacity, and you are, you're a reserve chief? What is the official title?
You're
the chief.
Emergency Medical Services Chief for the tribe. By the way, I may also become the Communications Center Chief. The entity that we were looking to do our dispatching told us that they would only dispatch one ambulance. So now we're going to create our own communications dispatch system. We will work hand in hand with them because we're going FirstNet, which is the dedicated bandwidth, number 14, for fire, EMS, and law enforcement. And so, as a result of those fires in California, Northern California, that people kind of confuse and call the biggest fire ever, there were really like 6 or 8 large fires in that wiped out the town of Paradise and others. Well, it also wiped out the communication system. Cell phones weren't working. Landlines couldn't work because the power poles and the lines had been burnt or melted. Microwave antennas, or whatever they're called, were destroyed when they were melted by the fire. And so the federal government created an entity much like the post office called FirstNet. So the U.S. Post Office sells stamps and other services to make most of their money to fund their operations. Well, FirstNet has a contract with AT&T, and they are building the nation's dedicated bandwidth, number 14, to just fire, EMS, and police, so that we don't have those kind of communications problems. And they figured out a way to create mobile systems that can recreate the cellular system or the Wi-Fi system that existed before it was destroyed by fire or whatever else other calamity might hit. I mean, we had pretty good earthquake in Alaska in 1950. I remember seeing the pictures of the streets having been raised up real high and buildings crushed and people killed and stuff. And so, Mount St. Helens blew up and caused a lot of problems. And so now I think we're a little better prepared and getting better at anticipating emergencies and stuff. And so it'll be easier to transmit information. For example, you might think the tribe, they're kind of little and small, but we also plan to serve the neighboring people that live on both southern Oregon and northern Nevada, Indian and non-Indian. And so the tribal council approved the purchase of 2 Zoll Medical brand new X-Series cardiac monitors and defibrillators, and North Lyon County Fire Protection District in Fernley, Nevada, invited me and 2 others to go down to Zoll's training down there yesterday to learn how this high-tech cardiac monitor and defibrillator can, while you're at the scene and transporting, can transmit the cardiac monitor's data that it's receiving to the doctor in the emergency room before you even get there. But you got to have the communications capability to do that. Well, Zoll has created a cloud system where the hospital ER room and the ambulance can send the information to the cloud and it can be shared. There'd be no violation of HIPAA because there'd be no patient identifying information. And so HIPAA is a confidentiality law. And so, and with regard to transmitting protected health information. And so whether it's Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or the cloud, emergency room doctors, like in our case, which is 74 miles away, will be able to see what is actually happening on scene by the cardiac monitor and the periphery of other devices that are connected to the cardiac monitor, so that they can not only be prepared, but maybe they can call us and say, hey, I'm seeing something that you're not trained to see, and here's what I want you to do about it. I mean,
that's incredible.
People's lives can be literally saved just by that kind of a communication.
Sure.
And so we are buying the same equipment that North Lyon County, and then one of our avid supporters, which is Humboldt General Hospital's EMS Rescue in Winnemucca, Nevada, they are getting the same equipment. And so we will have, I don't want to say 22nd century equipment, but we're going to have mid 21st century equipment now rather than later, since we're in the beginnings of the 21st century.
So with your initially in your career, your experience being in law enforcement, and then now today in emergency medical services, do you thinking about in the context of traffic related incidents, fatalities? Have we come any farther, closer to reducing accidents, or do you just see new behaviors like distracted driving just taking over for past problems such as drinking and driving? Do you see an improvement overall? Are you hopeful? Are we getting anywhere with this, or is it just the way it is?
Well, even in the 70s in downtown LA, there was a lot of traffic. I mean, one of the reasons that I was ready to leave the highway patrol and go to law school is when I first started working in the early 70s, rush hours started around 5 o'clock and ended at 7. Then it expanded to started at 3 or 4 o'clock and went to 9 o'clock. And then it seemed to be 24 hours a day. And, it's a heck of a lot of people. And so I started thinking, do I want to keep working in an area that has millions upon millions of people when I was born and raised in a really small town? And my grandparents instilled in me, since they had custody of me most of the time, that every other weekend they would take me to either my grandfather's reservation in Fallon, Nevada, or my grandmother's reservation here at Fort McDermitt, where they were members of those tribes, and they'd remind people who that white-looking kid was. And so I think that's what allowed me to later become elected as the tribal chairman, as people knew who my grandparents were. They taught me our customs and traditions, but yet made sure that education was important, because my grandmother really didn't like it that I had gone into law enforcement. She wanted me to be a lawyer, and I was on the transfer list to go to San Francisco when I decided it's time to pull the trigger and take off and do this law school thing. Of course, I didn't like being a lawyer, which isn't surprising. About half the graduates of every law school class don't practice law, but they do use it in business. And I found it very helpful as a tribal chairman, and then chairman of the umbrella organization for all of the tribes with land in Nevada. That's Intertribal Council of Nevada. And then as a judge, it was really important. And so it all seemed to fit. Well, it works here too, because I have to read grant announcements and comply with those announcements requirements. And that's what lawyers are trained to do, is read and write.
Now, I know, I think you mentioned a little bit earlier, so your EMS services, you're providing service to both tribal and non-tribal members in that stretch of area that your lands cover, which you had mentioned was those two highways, right? 95, I believe.
And Highway 140 to the south.
And as you mentioned before too, the distances can be great. You said you're how far away from the nearest emergency services? A hospital?
Emergency room, 74 miles.
74 miles.
And so is everybody else.
And what has been, I think, so from a non-tribal member's perspective, what is their general attitude regarding the availability of the health clinic and ambulance services?
Well, when I was chairman in 1987, there were a lot of non-Indians that were very friendly and worked alongside of us. I met some of the nicest people who were ranchers and stuff, but there were other people who were kind of standoffish. Like there was one ranch owner whose grandfather is notable for having killed a bunch of northern Paiutes in what became known as a certain locations massacre. And he thought that all of us were angry at him and his family. And so I just happened to meet him like around 1992 or so. And he asked me that question. He said, does everybody up at Fort McDermitt hate me? And I said, no. That happened back in the late 1800s. while there are some incidents of historic trauma, like Indian kids being taken away from their homes and sent to boarding schools where there was physical and sexual abuse and death, the old battles and stuff have kind of passed as being a reason to be angry with one another. And so we became pretty good friends. I found out he had another ranch in California that I used to drive by pretty often and really enjoyed the view of his pastures and stuff as I was driving by on Highway 50 on the other side of Lake Tahoe, to the west of Lake Tahoe. And so we talk every now and then when we meet out on Highway 140, because that's near where the one ranch is located. And we both know what kind of vehicles we drive. And so we can see each other coming for a couple miles. And usually we'll pull over just about the same time and talk shop, so to speak, about what kind of needs do the people that live down in that area called Leonard Creek need for medical stuff, because we're closer than Winnemucca is.
So you I guess what it is, you have like a mutual agreement for shared services?
Mutual agreements with the volunteer ambulance service in Jordan Valley, Oregon. I attend all of their monthly meetings. I'm also an advanced EMT in Oregon as well as in Nevada. And so this is all about building relationships. One of the strongest supporters we have of our service is Sean Burke, the chief of Humboldt General Hospital's EMS Rescue, along with Captain Fergus. Fergus is his first name, but without their support and stuff, I wouldn't have gotten off the ground up here. And I've got the support of a lot of different people throughout the state in the EMS system, both the state EMS office. There are people that have been immensely helpful, because we all have the same goal, and that is to try to keep people alive, whether they were driving drowsy and went off the road a bit and then they oversteered, tried to come back on, and that usually leads to a pretty nasty rollover accident. And if they weren't wearing their seatbelts, they get ejected. If they stay in the vehicle, like the last rollover we had, where about a 12-year-old minivan lost a wheel while the mother and son were traveling. The son was about 22 years old. The wheel caused the vehicle to swerve and then roll. And so we had to cut the mother free. The son was able to crawl out, but the mother was kind of stuck in a strange position. And after being in that position for a couple minutes, her muscles weren't working to be able to move herself. And so we had to cut her out of there once the paramedic that is 35 miles to the south of us got up here. And so him and I were then able to do things before the sheriff's deputy and the highway patrolman got there. But we've all learned to work cooperatively with one another. And pretty much we're all in the same family now. People don't want to travel 74 miles to Winnemucca to see a doctor or something when we have a federally funded health clinic and wellness center here on the reservation that's only 10 or 20 miles away.
Well, Eagleye, we're approaching the end of our allotted time. What's next for you? Is there a fourth career coming?
I'm going back into retirement. I just turned 69 on the 30th, and I'm realizing that while Red said stay active, he didn't mean to work 8 hours or more a day. And so I'm looking forward to going back to Pyramid Lake and just taking it easy, but figuring out what I could do as a young 70s or mid 70s, assuming I live that long. Of course, I keep watching those death notices on retired California highway patrolmen, and sometimes my ex-partners are on that list. And so, you can't help but think, your time may be coming. You don't know when, but it might be.
Eagleye, does the Fort McDermitt Paiute Shoshone tribe, do they have a website, or is there a way if people want to learn more?
The Wellness Center has a website.
Okay.
I think if people Googled Fort McDermitt Wellness Center, they would find the website. I know the tribe, you can get connections. There are some reasons to visit here. If you'd ever like to see the jail that Fort McDermitt had, a 2-cell jail, that building is still standing. Has about 1 inch or 1 foot thick walls, which I think is the reason that construction by the soldiers here at the time in the late 1800s or 1870s and 1880s is still standing. And we have the officers' mess building still standing. It was being used as a senior citizen center for about 30 years, but the mortar, which back in those days was whatever they could find to create to fill in the spaces between the rocks they used, that mortar is kind of falling apart, but the tribe is trying to get the state's historical preservation office to figure out a way how we can fund keeping it there, because it is a part of Nevada history, and it's not a part that we want to see destroyed. For many of our people, the fort was a good thing because tribal members were being killed outside of the range of the fort, and the fort was a place of safety. And so a lot of families have very good stories to tell about Colonel McDermitt and the captains that were here and the other officers and enlisted men. And the local cemetery in McDermitt even has one of the soldiers from that time buried there. So,
well, Eagleye, before we go, is there any final message you'd like to give us?
Well, no matter where people live, you need to take traffic safety seriously. There's one of my friends on LinkedIn is always saying, and I can't remember if it's you or not, phones down, eyes up, and hands on the steering wheel, or something to that effect. And, texting or even looking at a text while you're doing 70 or 80 miles an hour on a 2-lane stretch and you drift off the road can be really deadly. Same thing with driving while you're drowsy or driving while impaired. Pull over and take a nap, but pull over safely. I mean, you don't want to park on the shoulder. We have roads that pull off for 10 or 20, 30, 50 feet away from the highway. At least you won't get hit by another driver that drifts off the pavement.
Well, Eagleye, I can't tell you how much I appreciate getting a chance to hear a little bit about your background experience and helping us understand a little bit more about how tribal government works and the Fort McDermitt Paiute Shoshone tribe and some of your views on road safety. I think this has been a real valuable interview, and I'm very honored to have spoken to you. I really thank you so much.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the invitation. I really enjoyed it.
Once again, that was Ron Eagleye Johnny, Emergency Medical Services Rescue Chief with the Fort McDermitt Paiute Shoshone Tribe. serving the tribe's Oregon and Nevada lands, which include residents, tribal and non-tribal members living outside reservation lands, and the motoring public traveling off-road, as well as on Nevada Highway 95 and Nevada-Oregon Highway 140. Please share this podcast with your family, friends, and coworkers, and help us educate the public about critical driving safety issues. 40,000 people die on America's roads every year, 1.3 million worldwide. That's just unacceptable. Until next time, please drive safely.
You've been listening to the Driving Safety Show. To stay up to date on the latest episodes, visit driversalert.com/driving-safety-podcast. There you can sign up for episode notifications, listen to past episodes, and even request to be a guest on the show. And don't forget, the Driving Safety Show is the show that features the movers and shakers who are working hard to make our roads safer. See you next time.